Welcome back. On the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books. His latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, democracyatwork.info, rdwolff with 2fs.com, and Prof Wolff with 2fs at Twitter. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. I'm seeing, inflation is the big thing. And President Biden is going to speak on this in probably the next hour or so. Excuse me, he gave a talk about it yesterday. But as far as I can tell, pretty much every nation in the world is experiencing inflation right now. It varies a little bit from country to country, but they all seem to be pushing somewhere more or less in the neighborhood of 4 to 7%. If that's the case, why is this being blamed on Biden? What are the various factors and what part do they play, from the failure of ships to leave Chinese ports because of COVID, to a burst in demand as COVID goes away, to the corporate monopolies no longer having serious competition, to the oil companies ripping us off, to the Saudis refusing to increase production back, the 2.2 million barrel a day cut that they put into place, that Jared Kushner negotiated in 2020. That's still there. They're refusing to raise production back to where it was. I think because they want Republicans to be back in the White House again. What are the variables that are really consequential here versus Fed policy or Biden releasing oil from the storage, strategic stockpile, or suspending for a while tariffs on Chinese goods, which now I guess the Republicans are all hysterical about?
Well, the honest answer to your question is that inflations, like any other major economic event, are overdetermined, we say in economics. In other words, many variables come to play a role. And it's kind of a childish game to pick one of them and hype it. Usually that's scapegoating. In other words, it's convenient for certain folks to focus on what Mr. Biden did or didn't do and blame that. Look, yes, Mr. Biden's policies have a role to play here, but so do Mr. Trump's that take a while to have an effect. So do the decisions the Chinese government makes about how to handle COVID, and a whole host of other items that you mentioned and that we could add to because the list is long. And so rather than get caught up in the endless effort at scapegoating somebody, the people that are out of power blame those that are in, the people that are in go blame somebody else. I think what would be really valuable, if I can push it a little bit, is to be aware that an inflation is not a new phenomenon, that our capitalist economic system recurringly plagues us with inflations. In a way, it's the other side of bothering us with recessions and depressions. Then we have this other thing, inflations, and indeed, one often leads to the other. And what is striking to me about the discourse today, beyond blaming Biden or not, is the fact that we have in the United States, in our history, developed ways of dealing with inflation that are not passive, don't let it sit there, and are not raising interest rates, which is the way these days Republicans, Democrats, Mr. Powell at the Fed seem to be the only thing they can think of. And as a professional economist, I'm kind of amazed. During World War II, we didn't have an inflation because we stopped it by means of rationing. In 1971, Republican President Nixon stopped an inflation by means of a price-wage freeze that he imposed. And right now, as we're talking, utility commissions in every one of the 50 states, insurance commissions in most of the states, are regularly organized as public agencies that either do or do not approve of a capitalist who raises prices. If you don't get the commission's approval, you can't raise the price of water or electricity or any of the other public utilities. And likewise, the insurance company cannot raise the price of the premiums we pay. So we have experience with, we work with ways of controlling prices, and the bizarre right-wing shift of our government means that these things are never even discussed. It kind of reminds me of the last couple years and the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, where the successful government program of the 1930s that had the federal government hiring people was not discussed, as if it had never happened, as if it weren't an available policy tool. Every measure, including doing nothing, has its strengths and its weaknesses. An honest society puts them on the table, assesses them, and makes a choice. We're not doing that, and instead, we're engaging in these empty blame games.
I've seen 3 inflations in my life. I mean, the first I didn't see. I was a little tiny kid, but after World War II, yes, we restrained inflation. I'm not sure that the rationing was to restrain inflation. I think it was to equally, equitably distribute what small supplies we had of butter and meat and milk and you know, nylon, ladies' nylons and things during the war. But there was an inflation after World War II that bounced back after Nixon's wage and price controls stopped, and his efforts to control prices on gasoline. And you know, you remember this. We were living in Detroit at the time. I remember when the truckers went on strike, and you know, for 3 days there was no food in the supermarkets, and we had literally mile-long lines at the gas pumps where people were killing each other in Detroit over this. And when he ended all that, boom, there was inflation that lasted about 8 or 10 years and took down the presidencies of both Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter. So that inflation came even after the wage and price controls were done. So it seems like that's, you know, it's like trying to compress air. I mean, it's eventually going to reinflate. Or squeezing a balloon, it's going to pop out somewhere else.
Well, again, I would argue with you a little bit.
Please.
Every raising of interest rates that you can show had its sometimes success, and sometimes, as you put it, it came bounding back if the underlying problems were not resolved. We're talking about policies that are trying to dampen. In World War II, the rationing was crucial because you had a cut in supply because all of our resources, or a huge portion, went into the war effort, and so consumer goods were produced in much smaller quantity, and the demand was there, but the supply had been reduced. If we had allowed the market to work, we would have had an inflation to beat the band. And yeah. Roosevelt said, I can't let an inflation happen because we'll have poor people furious at the rich who get the scarce goods. We won't have unity, and we're fighting a war on 2 fronts. We have to have a unified people. So to avoid the inflation, we are going to institute the rationing. And the same thing worked in terms of Nixon. It stopped the inflation. It was a 90-day program when he declared it. They extended it a while. Then there was so much anger and bitterness because capitalist employers, the people who set the prices in our society, wanted the freedom that they had to raise prices when they could. And so they worked to undermine the continuation of the program. But we don't know if he had kept it, how well it would have lasted longer. But the problem that it may come back, that has to do with the underlying factors that are at play, that are, again, many, some under the control of the government, many not under the control.
So let's speak to that, because every one of these inflations was the result of an imbalance between supply and demand.
Yes.
Every single one of them. And you know, if supply diminishes, demand increases, or both, and you have inflation. And that's clearly what we have right now. You've got a demand increase as a result of the end of COVID. You've got a supply decrease as a result of China not shipping goods. You got a supply decrease as a result of the deal that Trump cut with the Saudis on oil and the war in Ukraine. All of these things are supply-demand problems. Once those supply-demand problems are resolved, as happened in 1947, 48, 49 in the United States after World War II, as happened in 1974, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the United States. It looks to me like it takes somewhere between 3 and 7 years for inflation to flush itself out of the economy as a consequence of the rebalancing of supply and demand. I mean, I'm not an economist, but it looks to me like that's almost a natural process, whether you raise interest rates or not. I mean, Paul Volcker gets all this credit for jacking interest rates up to 20% and destroying Jimmy Carter's presidency, but I'm wondering, did it do anything for inflation? Isn't it just a matter of waiting a couple of years and it goes away?
Well, you know, that's the ancient debate in economics. If you wait 4 to 7 years to solve a problem, you're running the risk, and John Maynard Keynes was the greatest exponent of this. You wait 4 to 7 years, you run the risk that the people who suffer the most across that period get tired of waiting and turn against the system as a whole. The whole point of government intervention, as Keynes wanted it, was to avoid that outcome.
So then you get like Hitler,
capitalism,
who was responding to the inflation in Germany. Hitler came along and said, I'll solve the inflation problem.
Exactly. That's your risk. You better be very, very careful. If you indulge the capitalist system, if you do not get in there and balance supply and demand. So
forgive my interruptions, but we only have 40 seconds. So is it that what we're doing is all placebo stuff, but it's necessary political placebo stuff to prevent the emergence of fascism?
I think what we're doing is hoping that somehow we can get it to be shorter, not 4 to 7 years, maybe only 1 or 2, and that will allow us to slither through without doing the massive intervention that our ideology makes us afraid to consider. Very dangerous kind of gambling with the instabilities of capitalism and the risk that we gamble wrong and have the horrible outcome ought to make people think and debate about this much more than they're doing.
Amen. And thank you for an in-depth conversation about this. I'm very appreciative.